Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Terry McVenis, the President and CEO of RTCA. Greetings from our nation's capital and welcome to all of you to what is now our 8th in a series of webinars, Aviation Technology Connect. We are pleased to have created this series via this platform to hear from a variety of aviation industry leaders on a broad spectrum of topics that will educate you, further inspire you in your profession, and perhaps even evolve your thinking as to where the industry is today and where it might be going in the future. Last year, our webinar series was very successful, exceeding all of our expectations here at RTCA. We have attracted an international audience of upwards of 400 people tuning in each month, not only from here in the United States, but also from Canada, countries across Europe, the Middle East, Africa, South America, Australia, and New Zealand. We've heard from leaders from the FAA, the NTSB, and others from our aviation industry. And we believe that today's webinar is going to be equally exciting and informative. Now, these previous webinars were all recorded, as is this one. So if you want to go back and listen to any of our previous webinars, you can find those recordings on the RTCA YouTube channel. We've been holding these webinars on the third Wednesday of each month, and like today, each of these webinars is going to focus on a particular topic, followed by a tech talk where you'll gain insights from an aviation leader that I'm confident will be inspirational, strategic, or thought-provoking, with the primary goal of them giving you, the audience, the gift of their knowledge. Now, I know many of you watching today are familiar with RTCA, but I see we have some first-time visitors with us. I want to take just a couple of minutes to familiarize you with who we are. RTCA is an aviation-centered standards development organization whose mission is to inspire the creation and implementation of integrated performance standards that meet the changing global aviation environment and further ensure the safety, security, and health of the aviation ecosystem. Now, in addition to developing standards, we also provide training to government and industry personnel on the application of those standards in developing the basis for certification and testing. On the screen, you can see some of our upcoming training events. Next month, we have one of our more popular courses scheduled, DO 178, Software Considerations in Airborne Systems and Equipment Certification. And then in April, 2 additional courses are scheduled on environmental testing and design assurance guidelines for airborne electronic hardware. You can sign up for any of these courses on our website at www.rtca.org. If you are interested or have any questions about our training courses, our standards development work, and or are interested in becoming part of the RTCA family of members, so that you can have a voice in developing standards, you can also contact us directly through our website or via telephone. Now, our ability to bring you these webinars would not be possible without the general sponsorships from our industry partners. And today, I'm especially thankful to Collins Aerospace, our gold corporate sponsor for this year, and to the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, one of our other corporate sponsors for today's event. Also, there's some material that our sponsors have provided for you, and to access that material, simply click on the documents icon and you'll be able to download those to your computer. Now, on this platform, you're going to be able to submit questions to our panelists today. To do so, click on the comment or question mark icon, and we'll be sure to share those questions with them after the panel discussion. So let's get started. Now, many people, including those familiar with aviation, are unaware of the behind the scenes work that takes place long before an aircraft component, or an air traffic control system gets certified and placed into operation. Standard development organizations bring technical experts together with government regulators to develop those minimum performance standards that will promote safety, ensure quality, provide a means to adopt accepted norms, and provide a basis to meet mandatory regulations. Well, these traditional aviation organizations may be familiar with this kind of behind-the-scenes development work. The aviation ecosystem is rapidly changing, with new entrants coming in the marketplace, some of whom have limited experience with everything that's involved in and necessary in getting their products certified and implemented into the NAS. So I'm pleased to share the stage today with our colleagues from several of the other standards organizations that play such a pivotal role in aviation, not only in providing value to the traditional participants, if you will, but are also working hand in hand with the new entrants in our industry so that collectively and collaboratively, we can effectively and efficiently promote new technology that grows our wonderful industry. Now, leading our discussion today is Ms. Dee Reimold, who serves as the Deputy Director for Policy and Innovation for the Federal Aviation Administration's Aircraft Certification Office. An FAA veteran of more than 30 years, she's held a number of executive positions as the Assistant Administrator and Deputy Assistant Administrator for the International Aviation part of the FAA and the Director of Strategic Operations for the FAA's FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation. At one point, she interrupted her FAA career for a time, serving at the International Air Transportation Association in Montreal. So at this point, I'll turn things over to Dee for some introductory remarks and to introduce our panelists. Dee, welcome.
Terry, thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this session today. I've had the privilege of listening in on some of the previous webinars, and really some fascinating content. And I would tell the audience today that while people generally don't get excited about talking about standards development, the fact that we're tying this discussion into the innovations in our industry does make for a fascinating topic. So with that, let me please introduce what I think is going to be a wonderful panel today. Al Season, with RTCA, Brian Meinke with ASTM, David Alexander with SAE, and Nadine Alamé with Open Geospatial Consortium. Thank you all so much for being here. Before we get started, I think it would be helpful for the audience to understand the role that you play in your respective organizations. So Al, could I ask you to please say a little bit on that?
Thanks very much, Dee. Yes, welcome everyone. My name is Al Season. I'm the Vice President of Aviation Technology and Standards for RTCA. And in my position, all of the special committees that produce standards within RTCA flow up through my office.
Great, thanks Al. Brian?
Thank you, Dee, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Brian Meinke. I'm ASTM's Global Vice President for Global Business Development and Innovation Strategy. I oversee an organization-wide business development group that covers ASTM's 90 industry sectors. In this case specifically, it's related to our 6 standards committees related to our robust portfolio of aviation standards activity and also associated emerging technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. David.
Thanks very much, Dee, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. So I'm David Alexander, the Director of Aerospace Standards at SA International, and I cover the SA Aerospace and Systems Management Standards programs.
Thank you, David. And Nadine.
Thank you, Dee. I am Nadine Alamé, the CEO of the Open Geospatial Consortium, OGC, and we've been engaged in applying international geospatial standards, location standards for SWIM, and these days for unmanned systems where geographic location precision is a critical element of the equation, and I'm very happy to be here.
And we are delighted that you're here in the discussion today. So thank you all again for those introductions. I think maybe to set the stage a little bit, I want to go back to a comment that Terry made about this series of webinars and how RTCA has managed to put together not only experts in the field and in the topics, but really focusing on some very timely developments. You know, for those that have been participants in some of the previous webinars, there's been some fascinating discussion about upper E air traffic management, and today circling back to this concept that we're going to explore today about how do we integrate the emerging technologies and operations into our national airspace system, and how do we do that safely and efficiently. And I think this is a topic that resonates not only with my fellow panelists, but certainly with others in the industry, members of the associations, as well as others, because we are seeing change in virtually every aspect of the aerospace system, and Terry referenced the ecosystem. For me, it rings particularly true. I work in the FAA's Aircraft Certification Service, the Policy and Innovation Division, and by virtue of its name, it's a clear indicator of the focus that the agency has put on the emerging markets. And in a similar vein, we've also created in my organization a branch that is dedicated to standards management, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit. But I think the important point to underscore is that the FAA has recognized the need for the partnership between industry and government, so that we can very effectively and very safely ensure that the new operations are introduced and sustained in such a way that it becomes the next normal, if you will. We have a close partnership, I would say, not only in terms of the fact that the FAA has very traditionally been part of the work that all of you have undertaken on industry's behalf, but I think more so today than ever, we have as data gathering exercise that's going on that indicates that there are some 500 different standards activities underway across 100+ committees, and those are the ones that the FAA is involved in. And there's also work that goes on, kind of, if you will, outside of the typical standards development efforts. So I'm raising this, and I think my panelists know that this is just another indicator of the value that the FAA places on standards development. I'd also note for the folks in the audience today that this panel is particularly special to me because a number of the panelists are part of a leadership meeting that we have quarterly among the FAA and some of the SDOs. And we've instituted those quarterly meetings for the simple reason of trying to make sure that the lines of communication stay open at the most senior levels, and creating a transparency so that the priorities that the agency believes is needed in the standards is known to the SDOs, and hopefully we always hope that those priorities are aligned. And I really appreciate the fact that you, Al, and David and Brian have made time on your very important schedules to meet with us to talk about those things. And I think, from my perspective, those are some of the best meetings that I have on any given quarter. I'd also note that we're seeing changes in how industry thinks about standards. I mean, as we are looking, and we've talked about this as a group, and maybe we'll hear a little bit more about this, some of the challenges that we're coming to recognize is that for many of the new entrants, the new companies coming in, they're sometimes very small businesses, and they can't really support that kind of the timelines or the resource demands to be part of the standards development process. So, I mean, these are things that we think about, and again, I think we'll talk a little bit about today. But it's more important than ever for us to keep these kind of dialogues going. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking and turn this discussion over to the panelists. And with that, Al, maybe you could give us a little bit of perspective from RTCA and some of the priorities that you guys are thinking about. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Dee. Those are great opening remarks because it plays very centrally into a lot of the strategy that RTCA is pursuing in our relationships with other standards organizations like SAE, OGC, and ASTM, and with the FAA and with industry. You bring up some really good points about small member organizations that want to have a role in the development of standards, and I think all of our organizations want to assist in that. And to tackle that particular topic directly to that end, one of the things that we have done is signed agreements with all of these organizations, with SAE, with ASTM, and with OGC, to cooperate with each other so that our membership isn't busy duplicating their efforts with multiple committees doing the same thing for different organizations. So we work together to make sure that we're not overtaxing the very busy industry that is trying to bring this technology into the marketplace while at the same time develop the standards so that others can come into it and to make it an easier pathway to get the technology out there. To your broader question about the strategy that we're looking for, we at RTCA see three main areas that are going to be central to activities that we pursue over the next several years. One of which is spectrum issues. So when RTCA was formed in 1935, we were the Radio Technical Commission for Aeronautics, and it was decided early on that the spectrum was a commodity, and there would be an aviation band that was set aside. A big section of the spectrum was set aside just for aviation uses. As we developed technology that used that band, we perhaps were a little bit too cavalier in how we divided up the spectrum and the use of the spectrum within a given technology because we knew we were spoiled and we had this band that was set aside for us. As we see the growth in consumer electronics and in other industries that are taking advantage of spectrum and wireless technology especially, and I'm speaking here, of course, of the 5G technology that is coming down the road, we see that there's these frequencies that are being used are beginning to abut that aviation spectrum band that we never really needed to worry about before. But today we do. And so we're working with not only our partners in the aviation business, but we're trying to work with the mobile technology and with the satellite communications technology companies so that we wisely use the spectrum and perhaps clean up some of the use of the spectrum within the existing technologies. And so you'll see within RTCA, not only are we looking for how the spectrum is going to be used by the new technologies coming along, we're actually going back and revisiting some of the older technologies that are out there and examining its use of spectrum, like distance measuring equipment, DME, like radar altimeters, and like GPS. So we recognize within RTCA, as I think the entire aviation industry does, that there is some role to play within the aviation industry to help clean up some of that spectrum use within the aviation band while working with the new entrants coming in that want to use the adjacent bands to make sure that we don't have interference between what we consider to be very important use of the spectrum and what they want to do with it also. So that's one issue that we're looking at is the spectrum issues. Second is software issues. And you heard Terry say in his opening remarks that the DO-178 training, which is our software standard, is one of our most popular training courses. And we find that year after year to be true. In the beginning of the aviation industry, what was really important in developing avionics for aircraft was the electrical engineering that was going on in there, you know, the sensors and the wiring of the avionics. As we begin, well, we're well into 20 years into the 21st century, what we see really is software being of extreme importance to avionics and to the entire industry as a whole. So it's not just hardwired connections within the avionics equipment anymore. It's the software that drives that uses that avionics equipment. And so it's very important that the certification authorities like the FAA feel comfortable with the software that's being put onto an aircraft or is used to control devices that are within the National Airspace System. So software is extremely important, and we see that the standard that is used for software to date, DO-178C, may need to be, we may need to provide some additional guidance material on it, or it may need to be updated. We're not sure. So we're looking at, we actually formed, one of our latest committees was the Advanced Topics in Software Advancement that is going to look at this particular issues. And we find that to be of extreme importance to the new entrants coming in, because so much of what they do in the UAS field and in many of the other new users that are coming out, the UAM and even commercial space, software plays an extremely important part in how those vehicles are operated in the NAS. And of course, the last issue that we are examining, not the last, but one of the important issues is security issues. So to date, we have been very lucky within the NAS and within the aviation industry that many of the components that are used in especially transport category aircraft and the rest are really to date were used within the cockpit. Software updates were very controlled. Everything was going on within the cockpit or within the flight deck. We knew the software that was being put on there. We knew the signals that were coming through to it. But now with the advancement in data sharing and with the use of new technologies like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and technologies like that are actually being looked at for use within the National Airspace System and within aircraft that operate within the National Airspace System, it's time to begin to look at the security issues that avionics may bring into the NAS and how we can provide for advancement in technology and new technology and new ways of doing things, while at the same time being very safe and very secure so that we don't disrupt the use of the NAS and we don't disrupt any of the users of the NAS. So for RTCA's perspective, we want to work with all of these other software development organizations to really have a broad front that goes forward in looking at each one of these areas in depth. And so we're looking forward to it. And I hope that through this venue, we may be reaching some members of the industry that may be new to RTCA or to the standards business, and it may pique their interest and may make them interested in contacting us to find out how they might play a part in some of these things going forward. So thanks very much. This is an august group. These are also my friends. I do talk with them frequently in other venues, and it's always good to appear with them and to speak with them. And I'm looking forward to hear what they have to say also. So thank you.
Al, thank you so very much. That's great. Nadine.
Yes, thank you. I think first of all, Al, Terry, and Dee for the invite to be here. As the Open Geospatial Consortium representative, I feel very humbled to be, with Brian, Al, and David, and maybe I would say we're the least known entity within the space, but we are one of the hundreds of standards activities that Dee mentioned earlier that FAA is participating in, and kudos for even tracking those and having an actual program. So in a nutshell, so that you can see my perspective, OGC is a community of global experts making location or geospatial information findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, fair. Everybody's talking about fair these days. So location, positioning, geospatial extent, relationships is everywhere in aviation, from the airport maps and the charts to the flight plans and the trajectories to weather information and forecasts. And of course, most recently, positioning of the drones, the corridors of operations, and also all the data that's being collected by the drones. It's all geospatial. I am biased, but location is everywhere. But it would help to mention here that if you've ever used any of the FAA or Eurocontrol swim feeds, for example, for aeronautical, weather, or flight, you have used OGC standards in getting the information and in actually encoding the information. So for the UAS space, we have been collaborating with RTCA, with ASTM, with ANSI. I'll mention one activity, the ANSI standardization roadmap for unmanned aircraft systems. I'm not going to say the acronym. And we've contributed standards around geofencing, APIs for geoprocessing the data. And this year, 2021, we've embarked on, with FAA sponsorship, actually, on creating, for those geeks out there on the line, a superset of GeoJSON to model and share position and geospatial extents used, for example, in remote ID and UTM. And that's been a collaboration as well with ASTM. So for this panel, Dee, you asked about priorities. As a newbie CEO, I've been CEO of OGC for 2 years. I find my energy has been consumed on the new stuff, because there's new Internet of Things and smart cities and digital twins and gaming and modeling and simulation and new entrants and new space. And I really appreciate the privilege of actually seeing across all the new, because there are patterns, and that's, I think, why we're here. We're trying to share patterns here. So here's where I'm finding my energy, back to the priorities. I find my energy focused around evolving our standards to be more accessible to the new. So there's a communication, thing here. I find my energy focused on bridging the divide between what we already have been doing for, in the case of OGC, 25 years, other organizations way longer, and the new requirements. I find ourselves being more than a standards development organization. We're now these forums that enable, empower, or strengthen public-private partnerships on this journey. It's also happening here. And connecting our innovation activities with our standards program. And more importantly, energy-wise, modernizing our standards development process itself so that we can create standards in a more agile way to meet this, amazing pace of innovation, but also this mind-boggling complexity of the problems in the domains we're now looking at in a world that's more interconnected than ever. I cannot say anymore, there's standards for aviation and standards for space. No, it's like everything is connected. So my priority today and every day is for none of us on the line, on the panel, in the world to reinvent the wheel, and for us to not end up in our rush to do something new, to end up in silos, but at scales that are so much bigger than what we're used to, because innovation is happening so fast. And I look forward to hearing from the other panelists on their perspectives so I can take it back to OGC. Thank you.
Nadine, thank you. And yeah, it's super interesting because of the market that you're representing. But I think you've really underscored how much of it is tied together. That there are not these very discrete pieces of our industry. It's all networked together. So thank you. Brian, over to you, please.
Yes, thanks, Dee. I appreciate it. And thanks, Nadine and Al. I think we echo a lot of the same sentiments. I think we've been around in the same circles now for a long period of time. So, a lot of themes come out with regard to what's happening in the industry, et cetera. So, but I want to take a different angle at this and what Dee's marching orders were to us as panelists with regard to, the perspectives that we're looking at from our organization standpoint. And, we talk about new entrants into the NAS. And, I don't want to look at new entrants as singular. I want to look at it as actually a community. And the community I really want to talk about is the innovation community. So just to give you a little background, I've been working to support technical experts in standards developing organizations in emerging technologies for nearly 17 years. First, I started out the American National Standards Institute. So Nadine mentioned, the ability to develop standards roadmaps. The first collaboratives I probably worked on back at ANSI, going many years back. But for the last 9 years, I've been with ASTM International, and I could spend, hours talking to you about our robust portfolio of aviation standards activity, including everywhere from light sport aircraft to unmanned aircraft systems, to aircraft systems, general aviation, aerospace personnel, and of course, the exciting area of commercial space flight. But one of the most interesting challenges that has surfaced many times in my career has been the lack of what I call interplay or interaction between the innovation communities and the standards communities. So often innovation would happen, and then everyone says the technical standards will come afterwards. Now, I'm not saying that innovation and standards development hasn't been there, but it's been done in an ad hoc fashion. Many industries are really missing out because the innovation and the standards communities aren't as aligned as they should be. So some of the long-standing and traditional reasons that have been cited for businesses being involved in standards is it helps them lower their research and development costs. Others have said that standards can help shorten their cycles and cut their time to market. Still, others participate in standards groups because they get insider knowledge and access to information. And still others simply want to make sure that standards support and not harm their company or a specific product. These reasons are all great, but they don't do enough to build on a strong bridge that Nadine mentioned between the innovation and the standardization communities. The gap is still too wide. So what is our approach? So we see the need for more of an integrated approach to innovation and standards development, whether it's the aerospace aviation industry, whether it's the construction industry that's going through a whole digitization themselves. We talked about the integration of adjacent technologies that the aerospace and aviation industry is using currently. This all needs to happen, and it needs a strategy. And what is that strategy? So our strategy really focuses on 3 areas. So the first area we talk about is early engagement. The second is robust participation. And then the third is leveraging the strength of standards developing organizations. And I'll go into a little about each of those. So when we talk about early engagement, we talk about examining technology developments versus the existing standards landscape. Where are the gaps? That goes to the whole method with regard to how standards roadmaps are developed. Usually they're developed not in conjunction with each other. You have a technology roadmap and you want to commercialize your technology right away. What we're seeing is this a shift or this paradigm shift of aligning standards roadmaps with technology roadmaps, aligning the R&D needs at the same time. So there needs to be a link between both of these types of roadmaps. Second is you would need to identify and you need to connect current R&D projects that can enable standards development. There's lots of R&D that's happening that there's a standards need or a standards deliverable that's warranted. Then you need to initiate new R&D projects to support the new standards activities. The key is simply to get the main drivers of innovation and standardization in the same room. Should be easy, right? And start creating a roadmap that integrates the plan for everyone. So the second strategy is really about robust participation. It's widening the circle and attracting more and more people to join the effort. What is that low barrier to entry? So we talk about small to medium-sized enterprises, especially in a lot of these adjacent technologies and emerging technology spaces, 1-2 person shops, et cetera. It has to be a low barrier to entry for them to participate in the standards development process. More importantly, the quality and the relevance of the standards are directly proportional to the participation, whether it's from entrepreneurs, innovators, universities, government groups, et cetera. So that's important. And then really the third strategy is we talked about, and Nadine mentioned it and highlighted it, is that how do we have to change our business model? How do we have to change how we develop standards? So we talk always about speed, digital platforms. I'm not here to sell you on ASTM's commercial platform and why you should be using ours versus somebody else's, but you need to weigh that. The collaborative expertise, open to partnering. We talked about public-private partnerships, Nadine mentioned from that standpoint. We also need a lot of agility and flexibility, especially responsive to immediate needs or national priorities. And we saw that with the aircraft disinfecting and cabin disinfecting initiative that Dee mentioned as well. And there's lots of other initiatives. ASTM is working on one right now with regard to personal protective equipment and a new face mask barrier standard. These are all immediate needs that the standards developing organizations need to be responsive to those national priorities. And then you need to also then surround that or wrap it around robust other service offerings. It's not just great that the standard sits on a shelf. So we've all talked about in this group, especially the need for the big topic, of course, is training, certification, workforce development. You need to be able to provide those other wraparound products and services, training, certification, other types of things that can go with that as well. So just to wrap up from this our ASTM's perspective, we have lots of priorities. I think what drives the priorities is about how nimble and how flexible the ASTM system is with regard to how we can be proactive in addressing those priorities and issues. The industry will define what the priorities and issues are for us, and they're doing a great job doing that. It's all how we interface with that. So ASTM has proactively developed our own technical experts program in the aerospace aviation industry. So we have technical experts on UAS. We've heard all about autonomy and the areas of UTM, UAM, et cetera. So we know that ASTM needs to be guided by technical experts and have those technical experts, not just our stakeholders that are developing the standards. We created a Centers of Excellence program, really focused on that research to standards that I mentioned in my opening remarks about standards acceleration. We've done this with one technology, additive manufacturing, and we know additive manufacturing is playing a big role in the aviation sector as right now. We've created advisory committees. These advisory committees are meant to be cross-communication, cross-pollination of all of our technical committees that can work on a key emerging technology all together. And then lastly, we need to be able to coordinate well with other groups. So I applaud what the FAA has done in Dee's group with regard to their refinement, because it's that coordination that's going to be key for the success of this industry to move forward with these emerging technologies. So whether it's the Consensus Standards Program group, the Research Coordination Group, your Center for Emerging Concepts and Innovation, we need to be closely integrated, the standards developing organizations, with those groups to move this industry forward from that standpoint. So that wraps up my comments. I look forward to any questions that come our way. Thank you.
And Brian, thank you. And David, last but certainly not least, over to you.
Thanks very much, Dee, and thanks to my fellow panelists who provided some really fantastic perspectives that I'll hope to add to. So from a broad perspective, so SA is a 116-year-old society. So we're talking about new entrants, but there's a lot of tradition running through all of our organisations here in our industry, and we focus on the advancement of mobility. So on the ground and in the air, we're talking about standards here. We have across the board over 400 technical committees and subcommittees that are comprised of some of the great technical experts that all my fellow panelists have talked about from across the stakeholder community. And I'll again mention this. It's important. These are referred to as industry standards, but it's very important that these are stakeholder standards. They're developed by that community, industry, the research and academia organizations, and government agencies in multiple areas, and that these are not just constrained by countries or regions, but these are global standards for our global industry. So we maintain over 10,000 documents for aviation, automotive, and commercial vehicle. But for this panel, innovation and industry advancement in in some of the most exciting segments in aviation and mobility is really critical. And some of the most exciting areas of standardization, many of which we're collaborating with our partner SDOs on, include things like electrification, artificial intelligence, machine learning, digital data, and as Brian had mentioned, additive manufacturing. And when we're talking about new entrants, I think these can be focused on a lot on new technologies, where there's something novel, a novel vehicle design or concept, a novel propulsion type, a system, material, a process, equipment, the infrastructure, or even the design mechanisms. They are increasingly led by startups, small companies, and companies, established companies entering the aviation space from other sectors, which could be automotive, computing, retail, electronics, and so on, working together with established names in aviation. And as Dee said, all working together to push innovation while improving safety. And this is really important because while our consensus standards are so critical and really increasingly critical to certification, to technology development, it is important that they are robust and of a very, very high technical integrity, especially in aviation, so that they can be relied on. The challenge for us is how to make the process of being involved in developing those standards easy and accommodating. So I'll start with just some examples of involvement and leadership from new entrants. There's leadership from an eVTOL company in our AI standards. There are new AM specifications, additive manufacturing specifications, being sponsored by new companies in the aviation industry. There's a strong involvement in new entrants in developing the taxonomy for electrified propulsion, and as we've talked about, research-based standards that are coming along the line to help with COVID mitigation in aviation. But we need to be aware that new entrants may lack awareness of relevant standards activities. So that's something on us to make sure that we're doing the necessary connections and promotions and really developing those relationships with these new entrants. And there's a lot of help there. There's working with key events like the Vertical Flight Society's events on eVTOL, collaborating with influential associations like GAMA and AIA, which is very important to spreading the word. And we need to have that outlook, and we've talked about strategy at strategic levels, at board levels, at council levels, but also at the committee levels. We have to make sure that there's that constant look on innovation, so that we're not leaving opportunities for duplication, and that new entrants are a big part of the discussions to move on that technology. Standardization has, in my experience, increasingly been less of standardizing the established, but working together, again, with those stakeholders, with industry, including new entrants, with government, with research organizations, to define that baseline on top of which innovation can be done, and therefore also providing that pathway to certification, where the government agencies are involved. And I think a really, really good example of this, of looking at something which is working very well, but accommodating some of these new needs and new entrants is in the area of safety. Our S18 committee, which is produced along with Eurocase WG63, some of the most important standards documents in aviation, such as ARP 4754 and 4761. So this group has looked at the innovations, brought in some of those new entrants to work on new products, like our 7209, which is a more performance-based companion to the best practice guidance, which will help with scalability. They have a UAS subcommittee, which is working on a document which helps to apply those long-established principles to new technologies, new products, and new concepts like UAS. So I think it's really bringing together the innovation of new entrants into building that rich tapestry in standards that can, along with research organisations, along with the government, use that new expertise to drive innovation, but safely.
David, thank you very much, and thanks to all of the panelists for just a really wonderful set of perspectives and priorities. I'm certain that those of you on this webinar today heard some very, very similar themes, and certainly one that has been articulated by every one of the panelists, and that's the criticality of partnerships, of linkages, whether it's between the standard development organizations themselves or the governments and industry, or the new entrants versus the mature entrants. You know, so I think this is certainly a theme that resonates. And really, when I stand back and look, and it's not just over the extraordinary events of the year, of this past year, Brian mentioned some of the work that ASTM has done in terms of personal protection equipment. But I'd also note, Al, the work that RTCA undertook rapidly to get some guidance out on aircraft cleaning, and David, your involvement in the NIAR, and the list goes on and on and on. And why I've highlighted that, it just stands in my mind about what could you know, easily be looked at as you know, a competitive environment. You know, standards organizations do exist; they're a business as well, but it is, you know, really in the face of not only a global crisis, but in the face of a really evolving landscape for us in aerospace, that this need for cooperation is more important than ever. The other item, and I think Nadine, you touched upon it, but it really was highlighted about in some of the recent conversations we've had, is about how we have to get standards to market quicker, that we need very, very efficient processes. And you know, I think I'd welcome any thoughts from the panelists, because again, as we're looking at innovations, really at the pace of innovation, and how are we going to react, any thoughts that you all might want to share with the audience on some things that they can expect to see in the future?
Yeah, I'd be happy to say something very briefly. RTCA undertook an effort a year or so ago to work with the FAA on something that we were at the time calling scalable MOPS, which was MOPS, of course, is the minimum operating performance standard. And a typical time that it takes us to develop a set of requirements and a document that covers a typical piece of avionics is about 24 months from start to finish. And when you're looking at innovation, as Brian pointed out, and David and Nadine have all pointed out, you cannot embrace innovation on timelines like that, a 24-month timeline to get a standard. And Brian's absolutely right. Standards are actually something that aid industry in getting to market faster. Many people look at standards as something that holds them back, and that's really not the case. The standard, when you have a standard available, that's when the true innovation can take place, and you're not playing the game of you know, what can I bring to a regulator that they're going to recognize and certify, and if you do have something that's complete, and you get through the certification process, which could take a long time, it may not be interoperable with other devices out there. So standards really do aid in helping innovation. So what we undertook within RTCA was looking at the problem space of a given standard, and what can we develop initially, quickly, on a very fast timeline within, say, 8 to 12 months, that we could get published within that time frame that would aid the industry in getting started initially, and then look at the tougher problems, the tougher nuts to crack at a later time, and sort of build on this growing shell, adding the additional capabilities within the standard in later versions at a later time. And syncing this up with a risk-based approach so that you tackle the lowest risk operations first and get something out to market that the industry can use, and then taking the time that you need to really tackle those higher risk operations is the key to getting something out quicker for those innovators, and still providing something that is of extreme value to those that are going to be in the higher risk operations.
Nadine.
Can I add to that? Thank you, Al, so I'd like to add just very quick points from the OGC perspective, which I think we mirror everybody here. We're making standards more relatable to folks, so we're calling them implementer friendly, developer friendly. They're definitely more concise. The boilerplate goes at the end, not at the beginning. You know, all of these things, they're little, but they make a difference. Brian mentioned you mentioned the quality of the standard is proportional to the participation. So what we're doing is we're piloting a startup membership category because we want to lower that barrier. We want these guys. Back to David's point where we're saying, I love this, like the standards, it's not standardizing the established, but actually setting the baseline for innovation. This should be an amazing quote. Thank you, David. But we're trying to develop the standards from the ground up. So with the community that's actually going to use them and is using them right now. And last but not least, modernizing what we have. So sometimes we need to, suck up our, legacy, right? And admit that we need to modernize to new requirements and new technologies. And in the middle of all of this, there's the education part. And I don't mean just like the professional education, but actually we're educating right here, industry, each other, and government big time. And we have to keep doing it over and over until we get to the same pace. Thanks.
Absolutely, thanks. Brian.
Excuse me. I know we're running out of time, so I'll just be real quick. All the things that were mentioned, that's great that the standards developing organizations can do those things, but it works both ways too. So we can change the innovation community of how they work as well. So when was the last time you saw a project call go out and it identified what the standards needs were as part of that project call for a research and development project? So when I talk about truly a paradigm shift, if we can get research and development project calls to basically identify what standards are existing, going to David's point of what's out there already and what's missing and what gaps are out there, and identify a standards deliverable as part of a project call, why we're making big inroads in relation to accelerating. Because could you imagine a short-term research and development project that leads to a standards deliverable at the end that goes into the process? So it works on both sides. We can do all the things that we can do, but other parts of the innovation community needs to change as well.
No, absolutely true. And David, you get the last word.
Thank you. Well, not too much more to say because my colleagues have spoken so eloquently about areas that we can improve on this, because it is really important, especially with the expectations, particularly of new entrants in the speed of standards development. But I think we need to also just take a step back and think about standards in relation to product development as well. And I think, touching on a little of what Al was saying, what we can do is provide different levels of standardization to help that industry grow, to develop that technology as we go along, not to go in straight away to try to rush to define some relatively strict performance requirements straight away, but to get those principles, to then work with them to start teasing out some best practices, and then ultimately, once the industry themselves have gone through that technology development, reach a level of maturity, then bring out those those kind of full MOPs as Al was referring to, and that's really looking at the whole process more holistically, and using the standards that we have and the consensus environments that we have to produce tools for the industry at different levels of the technology progression.
Thank you. And I really am so sorry to say this, but our time is up, and I think we could certainly talk in this vein for another hour easily. Al, Nadine, David, Brian, thank you so much for the insight, and it is always a pleasure to be with you all and to have such a rich and open discussion and exchange of ideas. So thank you all.
Thank you, Dee.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Dee, and to our panelists. Appreciate a very, very great discussion, and it was very informative. We did have a number of questions come in, but unfortunately are out of time. However, we have captured all those questions, and we will get those to both to Dee and to all of our panelists, and we'll follow up with each of you that have sent in a question so we can get an answer to that, because there were some really good questions. So again, thanks to this great panel. It really was a good one. I again wanted to take just a moment to thank all of our sponsors for today's event. Even during these very difficult times, these organizations have been gracious enough to make today's webinar series happen. And as I mentioned earlier, several of our sponsors have some materials for you. You can click on the documents icon and you'll be able to download those to your computer. So again, my thanks to Collins Aerospace and to AOPA as sponsors for today's webinar. Your continued support to the industry and to RTCA is very much appreciated. Now, to wind up our webinar today, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Greg Principato, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Aeronautic Association. Greg has spent most of his career in aviation, having served as the President and CEO of the National Association of State Aviation Officials and President of Airports Council International North America. He's worked on aviation and transportation policy issues for more than 30 years, serving on the staffs of a couple of US senators and a former Virginia governor. Of particular interest in today's environment, Greg served as the Executive Director of the National Commission to Ensure a Competitive Airline Industry, which is a commission that was set up by the Clinton administration in 1993 to look at ways to revive the aviation industry. So Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Terry, and thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. I guess the subtitle for my presentation, I'm told, is Turbulence and Resiliency, Why Aviation Will Be Unlikely to Break a Pattern of Recurring Crises. I was joking before the webinar started that our commission was supposed to solve all the problems, and we didn't, and here's why. I think it goes along too with the challenges aviation faces and explaining its issues, needs, and challenges to the press, the public, and to political leaders. And I think I want to touch on both those because I think they're related. So why was this commission formed in 1993? Pan Am, Eastern, and Braniff had just gone out of business. McDonnell Douglas was headed that way. There were massive layoffs and losses. The question was, why was this happening and what could be done about it? So my then boss, the former Virginia Governor Jerry Baliles, was asked by President Clinton to chair this commission, and Baliles appointed me executive director. Now we had big names, Herb Kelleher, Randy Babbitt, Felix Rohatyn, a bunch of other folks like that. It was the biggest aviation news of the year. Almost all of our 18 meetings were televised live by C-SPAN. Actually, my first little staff visit to DOT headquarters was the lead intelligence item in Aviation Daily, for those of you who remember that. The commission was called the National Commission to Ensure, big word, a strong competitive airline industry. So in our arrogance and confidence, a few of us thought we could actually solve these problems. Industry veterans chuckled and told us that the issues were not new, and while they could be addressed and mitigated to some degree, we are unlikely to permanently solve any of them by our commission or anybody else, that we would not be able to ensure anything. Indeed, when we look back, we found out there were similar commissions in 1974, in the Nixon into Ford administration, and even in the Truman administration. And when you think about the problems that caused that crisis in the early 90s that led to our commission, bad economy, high fuel prices, war, fear of terrorism, you can see with hindsight that the causes do recur. Even though we did not face a pandemic in those days, those who were impacted 15 or so years ago by SARS and MERS might point out that those concerns are not new either. So that's not to say we weren't successful. The report's still quoted occasionally today. Heck, y'all invited me here to talk about it today. Here's one reason. I'll hold up the report. It's a big, it doesn't look like any government report you've ever seen. It's got lots of pictures and graphs, things like that in it, written in plain English. One airline CEO complained to the governor and me that he didn't like the report, and we asked why, and he said, because I can't put it away. It doesn't fit in my drawers. It doesn't fit on my bookcase. I have to leave it out and look at it all the time. And we said, that's why we did it this way. So, you know, we did have some successes. I think the report put to bed for good the discussion about whether the government ought to re-regulate routes and fares, which had been deregulated about 15 years before that. There was a very lively debate even at that point, and a lot of people expected our commission would recommend that, and we did not. In fact, went the other way. We also ratified the benefit of the open skies approach to opening air service markets. At the time, there was only one fully implemented agreement with the Netherlands. A couple of others were in process. And one friend of mine back in those days said, well, if the Pope had an airplane, we'd do an open skies agreement with the Vatican. We also, for those of you in general aviation out there, recommended a statute of repose for general aviation manufacturers, which did revitalize general aviation manufacturing. So that's certainly a permanent and good thing there. We had 90 days to discuss a range of issues that were laid out in congressional legislation, which we put in the report. This whole page here and half the next page is the legislation. Lots of issues and lots of members of Congress who'd be mad if we missed one. So we kept score. We finished in 88 days instead of 90, returned a third of our budget. And to this day, I think those two things are the reason people were so positive about it. But the point here is that we did do some things that changed the industry for the better. We did some things. And you can see those today. I just mentioned several. We even recommended a more corporate way to fund air traffic control capital programs. And some reforms were enacted in that area, though the overall issue became overtaken as a matter of political or theological correctness, maybe a better word, for people on both sides. And so that debate went in a different direction. But I think by the standards of federal commissions, whose reports gather dust on bookshelves like the one behind me here, to prove how smart people in these offices are, we did pretty well, but we didn't solve anything. And here we are in crisis again. So there are many ways aviation's unlike any other industry. There's the obvious, the speed with which we can now traverse the globe. The safety, it's the safest mode of transportation ever devised, even safer than walking. It's the highest profile means of transportation we have. I can go on, but all these things also point to particular vulnerabilities that'll always be there. It's capital intensive, it's labor intensive, it's fuel intensive. It presents environmental challenges. Each of those things is a fact and a risk factor. Its ridiculously good safety record means that any problem becomes a news story, even the time a plane carrying Michelle Obama had to perform a go-around. All you pilots out there, a very routine procedure, but that made the news. Because it's so high profile, it's a target for terrorists and others who seek to disrupt our society or make some other point. So the challenges never go away. They'll recur. How we deal with them is what must change. How we understand them is what must change. How we communicate them is what must change. And that brings me to my final point. Aviation people love talking to other aviation people. We're doing it now. It's almost a theology. We share lingo, we share experiences. We even call entire cities by their airport code. Instead of saying I'm going to San Francisco, you might send an email to a friend saying I'm off to SFO today. We know it's a safe industry. We know the environmental successes and that aviation has done more than any other industry I can think of to become cleaner and cleaner year in and year out, even beyond any government mandate. But we do a lousy job, frankly, a lousy job of explaining that to the press, the public, and to political leaders. Journalists sometimes do a lousy job of covering our industry, but even the good ones have a tough time convincing their editors to give aviation in-depth coverage so that people can better understand it. If it bleeds, it leads too often defines aviation coverage. During COVID, there's much more coverage of how many people are flying than there is of what airlines and airports and manufacturers are doing to make it safe. I had a doctor's appointment yesterday, and he told me he was about to fly last night. He and his wife had both been vaccinated. I told him the plane would be the safest part of the trip from a COVID perspective, but I'm not sure he believed me. We can complain that so many people out there don't understand us. We can complain that our industry is not covered well in the news, or that legislation does not address our issues or is late in coming. Terry mentioned I was president of Airports Council International North America a little bit earlier. There were 23 extensions of the FAA reauthorization bill over 4.5 years, covering more than half of my time at ACI. I remember in 1982 being on the staff of then Senator Joe Biden and dealing with the 1982 FAA reauthorization bill and the ADAP program and all of that, for those of you who might remember those days. And that bill passed in probably about a half hour. Things have changed. And to change them, to better communicate, to better make people understand the needs of not only of our industry, but the importance of aviation, we need to exit this aviation bubble too many of us, I think, exist in, and talk to those who don't share our passion and knowledge. We have to talk to them where they are. The commission I ran came about because of some high-profile corporate failures and job losses. That's why our meetings were on C-SPAN. Knowing we'd have an audience beyond the gathering of lobbyists in the Department of Commerce auditorium, we decided to use the commission as a way of educating the broader public about aviation issues. We wrote a report I just showed you before, geared to the uninitiated. I know it was because I wrote it, and I didn't know that much about aviation at the time. Our recommendations were geared to policymakers. If you look at the 60+ recommendations, they're very well geared, but the rhetoric around it and everything else we did was meant to educate people beyond the usual folks. So I'm not sure we made much of a dent. We made an effort to break through, explain the successes and importance of our industry, and also explain its challenges and why it was important to meet them. We were not perfect. There's still more to do. Aviation will never escape the cycle of recurring challenges because of its very nature. We can be better prepared to deal with them internally, which require the kinds of expertise those tuning into a webinar like this possess. And here's the final statement. It will also require leaders who understand how to communicate to a broader audience, how to meet people where they are, whether they're members of the press, the general public, or political leaders who make decisions for our industry, so that we may not be taken for granted, and the more and more people can understand and appreciate aviation and support efforts to make it better. And so with that, I'll wrap up, and I want to thank Terry and RTCA for bringing me in. And I think if we could all agree that we need to do a better job of talking to people who don't share our passion and knowledge and meeting them where they are on this, I think we can get further on our issues in the years ahead. And I look forward to that. Thanks, Terry.
Well, thanks, Greg. What great insight. I really appreciate that. I know the audience did as well. Well, this concludes today's webinar. My sincere appreciation to Dee Reimold and our panelists, Dr. Nadine Alame from OGC, Mr. David Alexander from SAE, Mr. Brian Meinke from ASTM, and Mr. Al Season from RTCA. And again, my thanks to Mr. Greg Principato from NAA. Thank you all for your valuable participation this afternoon. And again, thank you to our sponsors for today's webinar, Collins Aerospace and the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. And again, remember to go to the documents icon on this platform to get more information about our sponsors. And for the audience, thank you for joining us today. I hope you found today's presentations educational, inspiring, and evolving. And again, these webinars are being recorded, so if you want to review anything presented today or view any of our past webinars, you can do so by going to the RTCA YouTube channel. I hope you'll all be able to join us for our next seminar, which is going to be held next month on Wednesday, March 17th, again at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Time. And next month, we're going to be doing something completely different. As you've heard from our panelists today, standards development organizations have a unique purpose: bring together the brightest people from diverse backgrounds and oftentimes with competing interests, then provide them a venue for them to work collectively, collaboratively, and in an environment of civility where all voices are heard and respected. The purpose is to ensure stakeholder success for all the participants. A few months ago, through a mutual friend, I was introduced to Shelby Joy Scarborough. Shelby has a background as a member of a former US President's advance team and a protocol officer in the US Department of State. Shelby is the founder of Practical Protocol LLC, which is a consulting and event management firm that produces world-class events for very high-level clients from around the world. She's worked with such notable figures as Pope John Paul II, Queen Elizabeth, Margaret Thatcher, Nelson Mandela, and a whole host of former presidents from both political parties. She's an internationally recognized speaker, an entrepreneur, and an author. And her most recent book, Civility Rules, is a must-read. And I'll add that she comes from an aviation family, and she has a story that I know will amaze you. So please don't miss this very unique and extraordinary RTCA webinar next month. So again, thank you for being with us, and have a great day.